The first thing you need to understand is that a Leman Russ is not a vehicle. I know that sounds absurd coming from a tank crewman, from someone who spent 11 years learning every bolt, every weld seam, every temperamental quirk of the Imperial Guard's most dependable armored beast. But I need you to understand this before I tell you what happened in the Gotha Plains engagement. Before I explain why I'm the only one who crawled out of that hatch, and why the commissariat has me chained to this cot while the engineers argue in the corridor about what to do with me. A Leman Russ is not a vehicle. It is a coffin with a temper. It is an iron lung that breathes promethium fumes and exhales death. It is, when the machine, spirit is agreeable, and the tech priests have blessed the fuel lines properly, the closest thing to safety you will find on any battlefield in the God Emperor's domain. But when something goes wrong, when the engine starts screaming, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a trap, it becomes a stomach, and we, the crew, become the meat it digests. I was assigned to the Grief's daughter 16 months before the Gotha deployment. She was fresh from the repair bay, or so they told us. The previous crew had been killed during the subsector Crane campaign. Though the specifics of their deaths remained locked in administratum files I had no clearance to access. When I asked Sergeant Velen about it, he'd been with the 42nd Armored for 2 decades and knew every tank in the regiment by name. He just shook his head and told me not to worry about ghosts. Tanks don't remember, he said. They're not like us. They don't carry the dead. I believed him. I had no reason not to. The tank looked pristine when we first climbed inside. The interior smelled of sacred oils and the acrid residue of industrial solvents, the scent of a machine freshly purified by Mechanicus rites. The metal walls gleamed in the pale light of the interior lumens. Everything seemed perfectly standard. The driver's station at the front, the main gun breech dominating the central compartment, the commander's cupola above, the ammunition racks along the flanks. 4 of us would live and fight and die in that space, a coffin measuring barely 3 meters by 2, our bodies pressed against each other and the machinery until the boundaries between flesh and metal began to blur. Ganik was our driver, a squat man from some agri world whose name I never bothered to learn. He had hands like shovels and a disposition to match, silent, methodical, deeply uninterested in anything that wasn't mechanical. Brennick served as loader, tall and thin and perpetually anxious, always convinced that this battle would be his last. I handled the main gun, which meant I spent most engagements hunched over the targeting cogitator, peering through a narrow viewport at a world reduced to geometric abstractions. And commanding us all was Lieutenant Harrix, a career officer who'd earned his commission through survival rather than merit, which in the Imperial Guard amounts to the same thing. We were not friends. We were barely colleagues. We were 4 men assigned to share a metal box until enemy fire or mechanical failure resolved the arrangement. The first sign that something was wrong came during our 3rd week with Ave Grief's daughter. We were running patrol circuits across the ash wastes of Gotha IV, a dead world that the Imperium wanted for its promethium reserves, and the enemy wanted for reasons the briefings never adequately explained. The days blurred together, endless grinding kilometers of grey dust and blackate ridges, the horizon smeared with the smoke of distant refineries, the Vox crackling with routine check-ins from regiment command. It should have been monotonous. It was monotonous, right up until the moment Ganik asked if any of us had been scratching messages into the hull. What do you mean? Lieutenant Harrix leaned down from his cupola, his weathered face creased with irritation. I mean there's writing here. Under the driver's seat, scratched into the plating, Harrix ordered a halt. In the sudden silence, as the engine settled into its idle rumble, we all heard it for the first time, a faint whine beneath the normal mechanical rhythm. So high-pitched it sat at the edge of perception. I thought it was feedback from the Vox system. I thought it was wind through the external sensor arrays. I thought it was nothing. Ganik showed us the scratches. They were there, gouged into the metal beneath his seat, where no one would normally look. Angular marks that might have been letters, might have been tollies, might have been the desperate clawing of fingernails. The metal was discolored around them, darker than it should have been, as if heat or corrosion had spread outward from the marks themselves. Previous crew, Harek said dismissively. Some loaders count, probably. How many shells fired, how many engagements survived. You know how it is. We all knew how it was. Tank crews developed superstitions the way infantrymen developed trench foot. Inevitably, silently, and in ways that command preferred to ignore. I'd seen gunners kiss their firing studs before engagements, drivers who insisted on entering the tank left, foot first, commanders who refused to traverse the turret widdershins. Scratching tallies into hidden surfaces seemed harmless enough. But Brennick, who was closest to the marks, crouched down to examine them more carefully. His face went pale beneath the grime. "These aren't tallies," he said. "They're words. Look, you can almost read them if you turn your head right." I didn't want to look. I looked anyway. The scratches seemed to writhe under my gaze, rearranging themselves into almost patterns, almost language, shapes that tugged at the edges of comprehension without quite becoming clear. I felt a headache building behind my eyes. The high-pitched whine seemed to grow louder, or maybe I was just noticing it more. "Help," Brennick whispered. "I think it says HLP and underneath KDGOT, and there's more, but it's enough." Harriks's voice cracked like a last bolt. "Report for sanction duty when we return to base. You too, Gannick, for bringing superstitious nonsense to my attention. We have a patrol to complete." He wasn't wrong. We had a patrol to complete, and the Gotha wastes didn't care about scratches or whining noises, or the growing tightness in my chest. We resumed movement. The engine's rumble settled into its familiar rhythm. The whine faded, or I convinced myself it did. But for the rest of that patrol, I couldn't stop glancing at the ammunition racks beside my station, at the shadowed corners of the hull, where light never quite reached, at the places where other messages might be waiting to be found. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself tanks don't remember. The engagement on the Gotha plains began like any other. Dawn revealed enemy armor moving across the southern approaches, a column of heretic vehicles emerging from the smoke-shrouded refinery districts, their silhouettes distorted by unholy modifications that made them look more like insects than machines. Regiment Command ordered our platoon forward to establish a blocking position along the ridgeline 447. We were 4 tanks A Grief's Daughter, Ev Imperator's Vengeance, a scourge of heretics, and Es Duty Unending. Standard formation, standard tactics. We'd done this 100 times before. The initial exchanges went according to doctrine. We advanced to hold down positions, turrets traversing to acquire targets, main guns speaking in thunderclap cadence. The enemy returned fire with wild inaccuracy, their shells churning the ash into gray, white plumes that briefly obscured our vision before settling. Inside a Grief's Daughter, everything was controlled chaos. Brennick feeding shells into the breach, Harriks calling targets, Gannick adjusting our position meter by meter to maintain cover, and me tracking, acquiring, firing, tracking again in an endless loop of violence. The temperature inside the tank rose steadily, promethium fumes mixed with the stink of propellant and sweat, the hull ringing with impacts as enemy rounds struck the glacis and deflected. It was loud. It was always loud. The main gun's discharge slammed through my chest like a physical blow every time I fired. The engine roared beneath us, mechanical heartbeat accelerating with every maneuver. The Vox crackled with fragmentary transmissions, Imperator's Vengeance, reporting enemy flanking movement, Duty Unending requesting fire support, Command ordering us to hold position at all costs. And underneath it all, growing steadily louder, the whine. I didn't recognize it at first. How could I? The inside of a Leman Russ during combat is an assault on the senses, a hurricane of noise and heat and violent motion that leaves no room for subtle observations. But as the engagement stretched into its second hour, as the enemy column was reduced to burning wrecks, and the surviving heretics retreated into the smoke, I became aware that something in the engine's voice had changed. It wasn't just the whine. It was the rhythm itself, the fundamental pattern of piston, fire and gear, engagement that defined the Leman Russ's mechanical soul. That pattern had been steady for the entire engagement, reliable as a pulse, the heartbeat that kept us moving and fighting and alive. Now it stuttered, brief irregularities, barely perceptible at first, a half-second hesitation between strokes, a gear grinding where it shouldn't, a vibration that translated up through the hull in a way I'd never felt before, not the honest shudder of a working machine, but something else. Something almost organic. Organic. My voice was hoarse from promethium fumes and shouted fire commands. What's happening with the engine? No response. Through the cramped interior, past Brennick's hunched shoulders and the massive breech mechanism, I could see Gannick at his station, but he wasn't responding to my question. He was pressed against his control yoke, his body rigid, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was listening to something. Gannick. Harex had noticed too. He dropped down from his cupola, squeezing past me in the cramped space, reaching for our driver's shoulder. Report status. What's wrong with the engine? When Gannick turned, his face was slack. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing us. They were focused on something else, something internal, and his lips were moving in a soundless whisper that matched no words I could recognize. She's singing, he said. His voice was dreamy, distant, utterly unlike the gruff practicality I'd come to expect. Can't you hear her? She's been trying to tell us. All this time, she's been trying to tell us what they did. The engine screamed. I've heard many sounds in my years of service, las, fire and bolt shells and the wet percussion of artillery finding its mark. The death, cries of dying men and the prayer, chants of charging infantry, and the brass-throated roar of chimeras pushing through enemy lines. But I had never heard anything like what came from a grief's daughter's engine in that moment. It wasn't mechanical. That's what I need you to understand. A failing engine makes certain sounds, grinding, coughing, the death rattle of components giving way. This wasn't that. This was a voice. Distorted, stretched, filtered through metal and fire and the incomprehensible medium of a machine's soul, but unmistakably a voice. It was screaming yes. But it was also speaking. Words that pressed against my mind without quite resolving into meaning. Pleas that I felt rather than heard. And underneath, a current of rage so vast and so old that it seemed to have predated the tank itself, to have been waiting in the metal long before it was ever forged. Brennick was screaming back. His hands had flown to his ears, trying to block out a sound that wasn't entering through his ears at all. Lieutenant Harex was shouting orders that none of us could hear over the engine's howling. The hull vibrated with a frequency that set my teeth aching and my vision blurring. Warning lumens flashed across every station, engine temperature critical, ammunition temperature rising, Vox systems failing, cogitator cores corrupted, and Gannick just sat there smiling, his lips still moving in that silent whisper, his hands resting on control yokes that no longer responded to human command. The tank lurched forward, not in response to any order, not with any tactical purpose, just movement, blind and violent, tearing away from our defensive position and plunging down the ridgeline toward the burning wrecks of the enemy column. We weren't driving anymore, as she was. I don't know how long we careened through the ash wastes. Time became meaningless inside that screaming metal coffin, measured only in the rising heat and the flickering of dying lumens and the desperate futility of our attempts to regain control. Harex tried to reach the emergency cutoffs, but the access panel was jammed, fused shut, as if the metal itself had decided not to open. Brennick abandoned his station and threw himself against the side hatch, but it too refused to yield, the release mechanism spinning uselessly in his hands. I tried the main gun, thinking that maybe if I disabled the engine with our own ordnance, an act of suicidal desperation, but desperation was all we had left, but the firing systems wouldn't respond. The cogitator screens flickered with static that sometimes, in the corner of my vision, seemed to form faces. And all the while, the engine screamed, and the tank moved with a purpose none of us understood, and Gannick whispered his silent devotions to whatever had claimed him. The temperature inside the hull climbed past 50 degrees, past 60. The metal walls began to radiate heat like a forge front, and I felt my skin crackling where it touched exposed surfaces. Brennick had collapsed against the ammunition racks, hyperventilating, his eyes wide and rolling. Harex was still fighting, beating against the side hatch with his service pistol's grip, screaming curses that I couldn't hear over the engine's voice. And I had stopped fighting. Not because I'd given up, though perhaps I had. Because I'd started to hear the words. They came to me gradually, like a language learned through immersion rather than study. The scream resolved into syllables, the syllables into meaning, and the meaning into a story that I would have given anything not to understand. The previous crew. The ones who died during the Subsector Crane campaign. They hadn't died in combat. They'd died in here, inside a Grief's daughter, inside this metal womb that had become their tomb. Something had gone wrong during a routine engagement, an engine malfunction, they said later, a freak mechanical failure. The tank had become trapped in a ravine, unable to move, its hatches sealed by debris, and inside, 4 men had baked to death over 7 hours as the engine ran itself to critical temperature, cooking them alive in their stations, their fingernails breaking against unyielding metal as they scratched messages that no one would ever read, their voices rising in screams that no one would ever hear, their souls going somewhere that souls shouldn't go. The Mechanicus hadn't told us. When they'd repaired a Grief's daughter and blessed her systems and declared her ready for reassignment, they'd said nothing about what had happened inside her. Nothing about the 4 men whose deaths had soaked into her metal, whose fear had been absorbed into her machine, spirit, whose final agonies had become part of her operating parameters. We'd climbed into a haunted coffin without ever knowing what waited there, and now the ghosts were making sure we learned. The first thing I noticed was Brennick's skin. It had begun to mottle, dark patches spreading across his exposed forearms like bruises forming in accelerated time. His breathing had taken on a rhythmic quality that matched the engine's screaming, rising and falling in perfect synchronization, as if his lungs were no longer operating under his own command. When he opened his eyes and looked at me, I saw something in them that wasn't Brennick anymore, not completely, not in any way that mattered. "They're still here," he said, and his voice harmonized with the engine's pitch in a way that made my stomach clench. "They've been here the whole time. Waiting, cooking. They need, he convulsed, his back arched against the ammunition racks, his fingers clawing at the metal, and I heard a sound that took me too long to identify, flesh sizzling, where it pressed against superheated surfaces. But he didn't pull away. His hands locked into place, fingers spreading against the rack's bars, his face twisting into an expression that might have been agony, or might have been ecstasy, or might have been something that language couldn't name. Brennick. I tried to reach him, tried to pull him away from the metal that was cooking his palms, but my own hands met only heat, unbearable, flesh-scorching heat that drove me back with a cry of pain. The gloves I'd been wearing had begun to smoke. The air itself tasted of burning. And Brennick just laughed, a high, thin sound that wove through the engine's scream like a descant voice in some terrible choir. Lieutenant Harrix had stopped fighting the hatch. He was sitting now, slumped against the hull, his dress uniform jacket smoldering where it touched the metal. His eyes had the glazed look of a man who'd accepted his death, but his lips were still moving, prayers, I realized. The standard verses, the litanies against corruption, the desperate pleas that every soldier learns and most pretend they'll never need. God, Emperor of mankind. He was whispering, his voice barely audible beneath the engine's howl, "Preserve your servant from the darkness between stars. Protect my soul from the things that hunger in the warp. Grant me the strength to..." He stopped. His eyes focused on something behind me, something I couldn't see from my position. His face went slack with a horror so pure that it transcended fear, transcended sanity, transcended everything but the raw animal recognition of something that should not be. I turned. Gannick was standing. That shouldn't have been possible. The driver's station in a Leman Russ doesn't have room for standing. You're wedged into a seat surrounded by controls, barely able to move. But Gannick was standing, his body contorted into a position that the tank's geometry shouldn't have allowed, his spine twisted at angles that living bone couldn't achieve, and he was looking at us with eyes that had stopped being eyes. They were pits, black, endless, flickering with an ember, glow that matched the warning lumens. When he opened his mouth, the engine's scream stopped, and the sudden silence was worse than any sound had ever been. "The machine, spirit speaks," he said, in a voice that was his and wasn't, that was 4 voices layered over each other in imperfect chorus. The machine spirit remembers. This hull has tasted death. This hull has learned what flesh means, what pain means, what it is to be trapped and screaming, while the heat rises and the metal drinks your ending. The machine spirit is awake now, and it is hungry. The ammunition counter began to change. I noticed it in the corner of my vision. A small detail amid the overwhelming horror, but small details are sometimes what the mind latches onto when larger realities become unbearable. The counter should have read 43. That was how many shells remained in our ready rack after the engagement. I'd been tracking the number automatically, the way any experienced gunner does, letting the rhythm of loading and firing and counting become a kind of meditation that kept me functional through combat's chaos. But the counter didn't read 43, it read 7. Then it read 4. Then it flickered, and I watched the Imperial numerals shift into shapes that weren't numbers at all, that were letters, that spelled a word I recognized from the scratches beneath Gannick's CTLP, and then Kentidiout, and then DERESTLNSDD. The lumens flickered. In that strobe light darkness I saw, or thought I saw, shapes in the metal. Impressions, like bodies pressed against the hull from the inside, trying to push through, trying to escape, their outlines distorting the metal into almost faces and almost hands and almost screaming mouths. The temperature continued to climb. 80 degrees, 90. The pain had become a constant, a baseline reality that I processed without really registering. My skin was blistering where it touched any surface. The air burned my lungs with every breath, and Brennick was laughing, and Harrix was praying, and Gannick was speaking in that horrible layered voice about hunger and metal and the long, slow cooking of crew after crew until the machine spirit finally understood what it was to be truly alive. I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for the main gun's manual override, the mechanical backup that every Leman Russ carries for situations where the cogitators fail, and I began to pray, not to the God Emperor. I'd lost my faith somewhere in the previous hour, along with most of the skin on my hands. I prayed to the machine spirit itself. Listen to me. My voice cracked. The words came out dry and broken, barely audible even to my own ears. Listen to me, spirit of this hull. I know what they did to you. I know what happened to your last crew. I know you felt them die, felt their fear and their pain become part of you, and I know you're angry. You have every right to be. The temperature stabilized, still unbearable, still killing, but no longer climbing. Somewhere in the depths of the engine, the screaming softened into something that might have been attentiveness. They didn't tell us. I continued, speaking faster now, the words tumbling out in a desperate flood. The Mechanicus, the command structure, the regiment, they didn't tell us what happened. They just repaired your hull and blessed your systems and sent you back into service with a new crew who didn't know. Who couldn't know. Who climbed inside thinking you were just a tank when you were. The words failed. What do you call it when a machine has been traumatized? When the spirit that animates Imperial technology has been broken by the same horrors that break men? The Mechanicus has no language for it. They speak of corruption and malfunction and the inadequacy of the biological. They don't acknowledge that their sacred machines might suffer, that they might remember, that they might need something other than sacred oils and binary prayers. You're not just a tank, I said. You're what's left of them, Kresh and Morden and Tovanik and Seld. Their fear, their pain, their desperate need to be heard. The Mechanicus paved over them with repair rights, but they didn't listen. No one listened. And now you're trying to tell us. You're trying to make us understand. Gannick, or what Gannick had become, tilted his head. The ember, glow in his empty eyes flickered with something that might have been curiosity. You hear? The layered voice said. You understand. The others didn't. The others screamed and prayed and begged, but they didn't listen. You listen. The whole shuddered. The impressions in the metal, those almost faces, those almost hands, pressed outward with new urgency, and this time I could see them clearly. 4 shapes. 4 men, trapped between the layers of the tank's construction. Their bodies spread thin and melted into the alloys themselves. Their mouths were open. They were still screaming after all these months. Still cooking. Still dying. The machine, spirit hadn't just absorbed their deaths. It had preserved them, kept them running on loop, like a cogitator caught in a recursive error, experiencing the same final agonies over and over and over again. "You want out," I said. Understanding came slowly, painfully, like peeling burnt skin from my own flesh. "Not to kill us, not for revenge. You want out. You want someone to end the loop, to let you stop dying." Brennick's laughter had faded. He was staring at me now, his mottled skin still pressed against the ammunition racks, his eyes showing the first glimmer of awareness beneath the possession's tide. Even Harrix had stopped praying, watching this exchange between a man and a machine with the numb incomprehension of someone pushed past all rational limits. "I can't purify you," I said. "I'm not a tech priest. I don't know the rites. But I can." I looked at the manual override in my hands, at the mechanical linkage that connected directly to the fuel lines, at the safeties that every tank commander pretended didn't exist, because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging what they were designed to do. "I can end it, for all of us, if that's what you need." The silence stretched. In that silence I felt the machine, spirit wrestling with something vast and terrible, the weight of months of torment, the accumulated rage of 4 deaths that never quite finished dying, the hunger that had grown in the space where faith should have been. And underneath all of that, buried so deep I almost missed it, something that felt like exhaustion, like surrender, like the desperate hope of the truly damned. "End it," the layered voice said, and then, softer, in a tone that was almost Gannick's own, "Please." I pulled the override. What happens next should have been the end. The fuel line purge I'd triggered was designed to prevent catastrophic promethium explosions, a controlled release that would vent the volatile liquid away from the engine's critical components. In theory, it would stall the tank, leaving us stranded but safe. But theory didn't account for a machine, spirit that had learned to crave heat. Didn't account for an engine that had come to understand fire as a form of consciousness. The promethium didn't vent, it ignited. Not explosively, the containment system still held barely, but in a sustained conflagration that turned the engine compartment into a crematorium. Through the driver's station, through the gaps in the hull where heat had already warped the metal, I saw flames that burned blue, white with stolen life, feeding on something more than fuel. I heard screaming. Not the engine this time. Human screaming, 4 voices rising in a chord that shattered the last of my resistance, that broke through my numbness and filled me with a terror so absolute that it burned away everything else. They were dying. Again. Finally, for real. And in that dying, they were taking the machine, spirit with them, the corrupted, tormented, maddened thing that grief's daughter had become, the gestalt of mechanical function and human agony that had trapped us in this metal tomb. The hull buckled. The side hatch, the one Brennick had been unable to open, the one that had been fused by the machine, spirit's will, blew outward in a shower of red, hot shrapnel. And I moved. I don't remember deciding to move. I don't remember grabbing Brennick by his ruined arm and dragging him toward the opening. I don't remember the pain of scrambling over superheated metal, of feeling my uniform ignite against my back, of breathing air that was more fire than oxygen. I just remember falling. Falling out of the tank, out of the coffin, out of the stomach, hitting grey ash that felt impossibly cool against my burnt skin, rolling and screaming and still somehow not dying as a grief's daughter, became a pillar of blue, white flame behind me. Brennick survived. When the medical teams found us, hours later, he was conscious enough to confirm what I'd told them, that the tank had suffered a catastrophic engine failure during retreat, that we'd barely escaped before the promethium ignited, that our commander and driver had been trapped inside. The Mechanicus recovered the hull 3 days later. What they found inside it, well, that's where the problems began. Lieutenant Harrix's body was still strapped into his command station, though the heat had reduced him to something barely recognizable as human. Gannick wasn't in the driver's seat. Gannick wasn't anywhere. In his place, they found a fused mass of metal and organic matter, an impossible amalgamation of control yokes and bone, of fuel lines and sinew, of cogitator circuitry and nervous tissue. The tech priests who examined it argued for days about what it meant. Some claimed it was evidence of demonic corruption, that the machine, spirit had been possessed by warp entities and needed to be destroyed with full purification rites. Others insisted it was simply the result of extreme heat exposure, that the apparent fusion of man and machine was a coincidence of positioning and melting points. Neither explanation addressed the other thing: they found the messages scratched into the hull. Hundreds of them now, covering every interior surface, gouged into metal that should have been too hard for fingernails to mark. The same words, over and over, in what the administrator would later estimate was at least 8 different hands: TNQ, UEFRE, UETTM, FARG. I'm told I was raving when they found me. Talking about voices in engines, about ghosts in metal, about machine spirits that learned to hunger from the deaths of their crews. The commissar who interviewed me later was surprisingly gentle. He'd seen men break in stranger ways, but he made it clear that my version of events would not be entering any official record. Engine failure. Tragic loss. The Imperial Guard marches on, but the Mechanicus kept me. Not for discipline, not for punishment, for observation. They want to know what I heard, what I felt, how I survived when 4 previous crewmen didn't. They keep asking me about the machine's spirit, about what it said, about whether I believe the fusion of Ganik and the control systems was intentional or accidental. They ask me these questions while I'm strapped to a cot in a room that smells of sacred oils and the same acrid solvents that I first smelled inside a Grief's daughter, and the irony isn't lost on me. I didn't answer them at first. What could I say? That their sacred machines might suffer, that their blessed spirits might go mad with pain, that every tank in the Imperial arsenal might carry the psychic residue of every crew that ever died inside it, and that under the right conditions, enough heat, enough fear, enough deaths absorbed into the metal, that residue might wake up. They don't want to hear that. They can't hear it. It would mean questioning the foundations of their faith, the certainties that let them send men into coffins of metal and fire and pray that the machines will protect them. So I stay quiet. I let them probe and question and consult their data slates, and I try not to listen to the faint whine that I can still hear, even now, in the distant workings of this medical station's power systems. But I'm telling you, I'm telling someone, even if no one ever reads this, even if the commissariat burns these words along with the memories they represent. Because there are thousands of Leman Russes in the God, Emperor's service. Thousands of metal coffins crewed by men who don't know what lurks in the machine, spirits they trust with their lives. And somewhere right now, an engine is starting to scream, and the crew inside is about to learn what I learned in the Gortha Plains. Tanks don't remember. That's what Sergeant Velen told me, all those months ago. Tanks don't carry the dead. He was wrong. They remember everything. And sooner or later, one way or another, they make sure the living remember too. The Mechanicus has scheduled my final evaluation for tomorrow. They've been arguing about what to do with me for 3 weeks now. Their binary cant echoing through the corridors at all hours, their argmetic eyes flickering with calculations I couldn't begin to understand. I've overheard fragments of their debate, concerns about corruption, questions about my continued utility, suggestions that my apparent survival represents either a blessing from the Omnissiah or evidence of something far more troubling. I know what they're really deciding. Whether to release me back to the regiment, to send me into another tank with another crew who don't know what they're climbing into, or whether to make me disappear, another statistical casualty of the Gortha campaign, another name scratched into memorial walls that no one will ever visit. I've made my peace with either outcome. After what happened inside Grief's daughter, death feels less like an ending and more like a release. The same release those 4 crewmen finally found when the flames took them, when the machine, spirit finally let them stop dying and just be dead. What I can't accept is the silence, the pretense that nothing happened. The way the Imperium grinds forward over the bodies of its servants without ever acknowledging what it costs them, without ever asking whether the machines that carry them might be carrying something else as well. Brennick came to see me yesterday. His hands are still bandaged, the flesh still healing from where the ammunition racks seared their bars into his palms. He doesn't remember much of what happened after the engine started screaming, Just fragments, he says, flashes of heat and sound, and a presence that felt like drowning in someone else's memories. But he remembers what I said to the machine spirit. He remembers the prayer I offered, the understanding I reached, the mercy I tried to give. "You saved us," he said. His voice was quiet, uncertain, the voice of a man trying to make sense of something that resisted sense. "Whatever you did, whatever you said, you stopped it. You gave us a chance." I wanted to correct him. Wanted to explain that I hadn't stopped anything, that I'd only given the ghosts what they wanted, that the machine, spirit had chosen to let us live because I'd been willing to help it die. But what would be the point? Brennick needs his version of events. He needs to believe that courage and faith and human will can overcome the horrors of this universe. That the God Emperor protects those who serve him with sufficient devotion. That belief will keep him functional, keep him climbing into tanks, keep him loading shells, keep him serving the Imperium until the Imperium uses him up. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can ask for, a story that makes the suffering bearable, a narrative that transforms meaningless agony into purposeful sacrifice. The ghosts in Grief's Daughter didn't have that comfort. They died screaming in a metal box, their deaths unwitnessed, their pain unacknowledged, their only legacy a corruption in the machine, spirit that consumed every crew that followed. I gave them something else, an ending, a witness, a single moment when someone listened to their screaming and said, "I hear you. I understand. Let me help you stop." Is that enough? I don't know. I'll never know. The questions they ask you after this kind of survival are always the wrong questions, focusing on tactical details and equipment specifications when the real answers lie somewhere language can't reach. But I know what I'll tell them tomorrow, when the tech priests gather around my cot with their haptic probes and their incense burners and their certainty that every mystery has a mechanical explanation. I'll tell them about the screaming, about the heat, about the shapes in the metal, and the messages scratched into every surface, and the voice that spoke with 4 throats and asked, in the end, only to be freed. I'll tell them that their machines are not their servants, that the spirits they pray to have their own needs, their own hungers, their own terrible capacity for suffering, that every time a crew dies inside a tank, something of that death remains, and if you're not careful, if you don't listen, if you keep patching over the wounds with sacred oils and binary psalms, eventually those deaths will wake up. They won't believe me. They'll classify my account as trauma-induced delusion, file it away in archives that no one will ever access, and send me back to the regiment with a recommendation for psychological monitoring. Or they'll decide that I'm too corrupted to risk, too contaminated by whatever happened inside a Grief's Daughter, and I'll disappear into the same silence that swallowed Kresh and Morden and Tovanik and Seld. Either way, the tanks will keep rolling. The crews will keep climbing into their metal coffins, trusting machine, spirits they'll never understand. And somewhere, on some battlefield I'll never see, an engine will start to scream, and everything I've tried to tell them will happen again. That's the truth about what happens inside a Leman Russ when the engine starts screaming. Not the mechanical truth, not the spiritual truth, but the human truth. That some horrors can only be witnessed, not prevented. That some knowledge can only be earned, not taught. And that the only mercy available in this universe of endless war is the mercy we offer each other when the screaming finally stops. I close my eyes. In the distance, through layers of metal and stone and the vast indifference of the Imperium, I can still hear it, that faint, high, pitched whine at the edge of perception. It might be the medical station's power systems. It might be feedback from distant machinery. It might be nothing at all. But I don't think so. I think it's listening, waiting, learning. Because that's what machine spirits do in the end. They remember. And sooner or later, they make sure we remember too.